I'm the hormone specialist, pharmacist Lane Kilpatrick, and this is you, Chief Medical Officer. Welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Dr. Dale Bredesen, and forgive me if I read this because I don't want to miss anything. He's a neuroscientist, neurologist, and a professor in the field of neurodegenerative diseases. He was the founding president and CEO of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. He's currently the founder and chief science officer of Gray Matters, a clinical total brain and body health practice. Is that accurate?
Accurate. Yeah, thank you.
His laboratory research over 30 years is focused on mechanisms underlying neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, leading to the first successful reversals of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. That's significant. Published in 2014, 2016, and 2018. Dr. Bredesen is a prodigious innovator in medicine with over 30 patents to his name. He's authored over 220 scholarly publications and case studies. When you're talking Alzheimer's, you don't get any more qualified than Dale Bredesen, I think it's safe to say. He's also a New York Times best-selling author, by the way, on this subject, so people understand when he speaks. He's a great educator. Welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be here. Thanks, Lane.
It is a distinct privilege to get some of your time today. Honestly, I mean that. Let me just start by setting the stage here. By my reckoning, we have experienced more than a 400% increase in Alzheimer's cases over the last 50 years. And the curve is not flat. It's continuing to go up. It's increasing all the time, getting steeper. So whatever we're doing just is not working. This came into my sphere of interest because of my bioidentical hormones is what I specialize in, and we'll talk about that later. And there is an impact of hormones on neurodegenerative diseases. So this has to be one of the biggest failures in modern medicine, in my view. In fact, you have said, let me read this, everyone knows a cancer survivor, no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor.
Until now.
Until now.
Yep.
That's important to add that last part. This is very grim and a frightening statement. Let me quote from page 6 of your book, The End of Alzheimer's. In virtually every other disease, there's a strong sense that research is on the right track, that the basics are understood, that although nature will keep throwing curveballs at us, she's revealed to us the fundamental rules of the game. Not so with Alzheimer's. In this disease, it's as if nature handed us a rule book written in disappearing ink and edited by evil gremlins who rewrite entire sections when our backs are turned. Will you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, to me, and this has been our primary area of interest, what is the underlying mechanism? What is actually driving this process? Because if you look at cardiovascular disease, people feel that they understand what's actually going on there. If you look at cancer, we understand oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes and things like that, although, fair enough, metabolic changes have come into focus in the last several years especially. But in neurodegenerative diseases, starting with Alzheimer's, you have people who spend their entire lives saying, you get this because of amyloid, another group because of tau, another group because of prions, another group because of free radicals, another group because of aggregated proteins, misfolded proteins, herpes simplex. You just go on and on and on. So there are all these theories about what is actually driving this process, which makes it very difficult to say, well, what should we do about it? And so people will then say, in fact, I was at a meeting where a very famous neuropathologist said, we just need to have antibodies to remove all 4 of the misfolded. So he had identified 4 different misfolded proteins and said, we just have to suck them all out of there with antibodies. Well, what if there are 10 more? So none of these theories has ever led to a successful treatment of this. So we have our research led to a very, very different look at what this disease actually is. And that tells you how to prevent it and how to treat it.
So when you say none of these have led to a successful treatment of the disease, what do you mean by that? What are you considering successful treatment?
Right. So when I say successful treatment, I'm glad you brought that up. people are going downhill like this over time. A successful treatment is now they go back uphill and preferably end up doing very well back to normal. What's happened is the best that people have done, for example, with these recent antibodies like Leqembi and now I think it's Kisunla is this new one. Instead of going downhill, you go downhill slightly more slowly. You still go downhill, but you go downhill slightly more slowly. So none of these approaches has ever said, aha. I mean, there are people out there treating people with anti-herpes drugs, which is great. That is an important contributor out of dozens and dozens of contributors. But this idea that you're now going to suddenly bounce back to normal simply has not happened.
Yeah, there's a heartwarming comment in that same book of yours from a caregiver. Let me just read that. One man whose wife was in the midst of the long goodbye of Alzheimer's shook his head, bereft, and said, "We're told repeatedly that drugs are being developed that will slow the decline. But why would anyone do that? I can tell you, living with this every day, that's the last thing you'd want." That's pretty poignant.
Yeah, I remember very well when he said that. It's very sad because he's saying, at some point, you want it to be over. You want it to be faster, not slower. It's said again, it's just it's symptomatic of how dysfunctional this field has been over the last 100 years since Alzheimer himself first showed this in 1906.
This has got to be just terrifying. This diagnosis. If someone's looking at just drugs available and how little difference they make, that makes for a really hopeless situation. And why are so many drugs? Why do so many drugs fail to meet FDA approval? Do you think?
Yeah, it's a great point. It comes back to this same question. It's because people don't understand what the disease is. And so what they do is they say, let's go after this piece, or let's go after that piece, or let's go after tau or A beta. And the thing is that the hope on the business side is, well, the bar is so low. If we can just get a tiny, tiny effect, we can sell billions and billions of dollars of drugs. And that's really sad.
Yeah, success. For
the people who need it, that is such a sad statement, unfortunately. So that people have gone after the wrong things, and this is not that simple of a disease. This is a complex chronic illness, and what our research suggested, which is the thing that's actually led to people getting better, is that this is a network insufficiency, so that you have a whole set of things controlling this network, and that you've now got to identify them and address them. So that means, number one, this is going to be a personalized protocol. It's going to be a little different for each person depending on what's dragging your network down. For some people, it's specific pathogens. You've got to find them and treat them. For others, it is specific toxins. You've got to find them and treat them. For others, it's more metabolic. You've got to identify that and treat that. So that's the first piece. And then you have to keep optimizing. You've got to keep tweaking to make that network functional once again. When you do that, you actually get much better outcomes. And we got, the first improvements. I wrote another book called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. It's amazing just hearing these people. We had 7 different people who all had improvements, and they wrote about their improvements. They wrote about what it was like to be told by a doctor, I'm going to die of Alzheimer's, and then actually to start getting better and to be with their families and all that. It's heartwarming. It's hard not to shed a tear reading these amazing stories from people who've been through this.
Oh yeah. So since the release of your book, which was 2017, I believe, is that right?
Yeah.
So there have been 3, and you made a good point there that there hadn't been a new drug approved for Alzheimer's in near 20 years, right?
Right.
Since 2003, I believe, was when memantine. Yeah.
Of course, memantine. Yeah.
So now, since the release of your book, there have been 3 new Alzheimer's drugs approved by the FDA. The Aduhelm, so aducanumab, these get tongue twister even for me as a pharmacist, aducanumab, and then Leqembi, lecanemab, and then this new one, Kisunla. Any of those do anything for you?
No.
So more of the same.
So here's the problem. You've got this disease where you're only going one direction, you're going downhill. And what was done was they kept moving. It used to be that they would treat people relatively late in the process and see, can we actually make people better? They gave up on that. So they're taking people who are in early stages, where in those early stages, you see improvements with exercise. You see improvements with better sleep. You see improvements with less stress. These are all things that improve you. So that they're now comparing their drug, but they're not saying, oh, by the way, all these other things are also just as good and much easier to do. Here are drugs that are slowing the decline. In the case of Leqembi, it's 27% slowing. In the case of Kisunla, it's about 35% slowing. But can you imagine if Elon Musk said to you, hey, Lane, really great news. All of our rockets still explode and kill all the astronauts, but they explode 27% later. Would that really be, would you say, wow, that is really fantastic, Elon. What a great success. We don't want people going downhill. We want them to get better, not worse.
And what you're saying is everybody's kind of given up on that, apparently.
Yeah, and the thing is, as you know, these things come with horrible side effects. And again, as you said, as a pharmacist, so, you're used to, what are the side effects for each of these drugs? Well, brain bleeding, brain swelling, and death. Those are the side effects. Those are not good side effects. Now, my hope is that in the future, this idea of removing your amyloid, do the other things first. Get your network functioning again. Get appropriate exercise. There are 6 major things that drive these networks down, and those are energetics, so reduction in energetics. That's blood flow, mitochondrial function, oxygenation, and all those sorts of things. Inflammation from many different pathogens and leaky gut and all those sorts of things. And toxicity, surprisingly common. We are exposed to so many of these different toxins, organics, inorganics, biotoxins. And then neurotrophins, neurotransmitters, and stress. Surprisingly, as a scientist, I never thought that stress was going to be such an important piece of a neurodegenerative condition. It turns out to be very important, and you have to address that to get the best outcomes. So fix those things first, get people going in the right direction. Now you want to remove the amyloid that's sitting in the brain. Mm-hmm. Start with these drugs at lower doses. They are hitting these things so that it's literally ripping the amyloid out of the brain, because they're trying to get a quick result and show that this works. Well, the problem is amyloid sits in your blood vessels among other places. So what happens when you rip a patch off a tire? It leaks, of course, and that's what happens with these, and you get these microhemorrhages. So it's just I have to say, it's a misguided 1990s approach. It's like the 1990s called. They want their Alzheimer's treatment back. Yeah, it's really an outdated approach, unfortunately.
And most people understand. They've heard these terms: beta amyloid or amyloid beta, the tau, those sorts of things. And what you have an interesting and a novel position on amyloid plaque. You believe it's not so much pathological by itself as it is a natural protective mechanism the body's devised to, it's a bit of a red herring in the search for an effective treatment. Maybe a better way of saying that would be, you see it more as diagnostic rather than causative. Would that be accurate?
Yes, and I would say, Professor Lee Hood, who invented the automated DNA sequencer, just a brilliant leading biotechnologist, said the exact same thing in his book, which is called The Age of Scientific Wellness, and talking about how where we're changing from this disease model where we get things very late to more of a model where we can see disease transitions, and said the exact same thing. But here's the point. That doesn't mean it can't be something you target. That's fair. When you get an infection, if you get infected by COVID, or you get infected by a bacterium or a spirochete or a fungus, what have you, especially if you get infected by a virus, you're going to make interferon, right? Depending on what you're infected by, you may make some TNF. You may make numerous cytokines, IL-1 and things like this. This is the class of things that amyloid is in. Amyloid is part of your innate immune system's response to an insult. Okay, so, when you take steroids, you're knocking down your response. So, okay, there may be a place for it. But when you have COVID or when you have a bad infection, if I treat you with nothing more than something that prevents your body from responding to that infection, that is not a very smart overall approach, is it?
No, doesn't seem like it.
And that's the problem. So amyloid is part of the body's response to various insults.
Okay. Stories of real patients really bring this alive for me. You talk about patient zero for you.
Yes.
That sort of launched your protocol, I believe in 2012, somewhere around that time was when she came to see you. She was 65 years old then. That would make her about, 77 now? Did she?
She just turned 80.
So she's still living apparently. How's she doing?
Yeah, she's doing great. And she's actually working as a brain health coach. She just there was a screening of the documentary Memories for Life, Reversing Alzheimer's, which is on Amazon Prime. But there was a screening in New York at the Jacob Burns Film Center just earlier this week. And she was there. She went to the screening.
That's amazing.
She's amazing. She still rides her bike many, many miles and keeps herself in great shape. She's a yoga instructor. She's remarkable.
And interestingly, she's gone on and off this several times, hasn't she? Because of things beyond her control. But each time she returned to the protocol, she kind of picked up and got herself back to the same low symptom rate of cognitive decline that she had achieved before she went off. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And, that's one of the things that tells us we're on the right track here. When people go on the protocol, they get better. When they go off it, they get worse. When they go on it, they get better again. And so it tells you that there's this temporal association, and it says that this is the right sort of thing to do. Now, in her case, she ran out of some things a few times. She was traveling. She would be sent by the U.S. government overseas. And the interesting thing is, people had said before that because this disease is about amyloid, if you just get someone to get better, they should be able to be without treatment for years because you've gotten rid of that amyloid. But it's interesting. What this showed us was, no, this is a dynamic system. She got worse within 7 to 10 days each time, so that you can see this is not just about something that's collected over years. This is an active, ongoing, dynamic process.
What got it there in the first place, it will put it back.
Exactly.
There are maybe 7 to 8 million people just in the U.S. currently suffering from Alzheimer's disease. They say there's a new diagnosis every 65 seconds.
No.
I find it instructive to look at actual patients slide into the disease. It gives them, that gives people an idea of what to look for in their own lives and pay attention to. Can we look at that patient that you call Eleanor in your book? As a typical example, I can remind you of the things that she had if you don't have those right on the tip of your tongue.
Yeah. Well, as you know, all of these people, these are pseudonyms. So I coded their names. And as I recall, Eleanor is the one you're talking about who's in New York. And did you talk about the one who was the attorney or is an attorney still? Who got her piano playing back? Is that the one you're talking about?
And foreign languages, Chinese and Russian. Yeah. So she had these 12 things that you listed out there.
Yeah. She is an amazing human being, brilliant woman. And what happened to her was her grandmother had died of Alzheimer's disease. Her father, who was a brilliant neurologist, had died, was just dying. It was a little end stage. And she was actually in her late 40s and clearly noticing problems. She was mixing up words. She was having trouble with naming things. She was noticing, she said she felt like there was gauze on her head. And by the way, she's actually in this documentary as well. And Michael Bublé did a great job with his narration of the documentary. And she talks about what it feels like to have early Alzheimer's. So she went in to a university center of excellence, and they told her, your testing is not perfect. It's not great. You may be on your way. She turned out to have ApoE4, which is the most common genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. So again, it made sense that it's running in her family. And of course, she turned around and looked at her children and thought, oh my gosh, in 30 years, they're going to be going through this same thing. And so she ended up, her sister-in-law had seen a paper that I had written about reversal of cognitive decline, which included patient 0, and said, oh, you need to read this book. She read the book. She started doing this. She wrote to me. So we started coordinating, here are the things you have to, here are the tests you have to get, here are the things you need to do to get optimal improvement. And it took her, it typically takes people 3 to 6 months. So in her case, it was about 4 months. She was really starting to notice improvements. And it was interesting. She had lost the ability to sight read music, and she got that back. She got her ability to read music back. She plays the piano beautifully. And she got back the ability. She also spoke Chinese. She had learned that in high school. She got that back as well. She said she was actually driving down the road, and all this language started just coming back into her brain because her brain was basically working once again. And she was very sharp once again. Did not say the wrong words and things like that.
So let's go through some of these other ones here, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Facial blindness, is that pretty common as people slide into this cognitive decline?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. It's very common. It's called prosopagnosia. And what happens is it is a function of the non-dominant parietal lobe. And when you get Alzheimer's, it typically affects, for most people, it affects temporal lobe, parietal lobe. Now, we see some where it's mostly parietal lobe, and they have a more non-amnestic sort of syndrome with things like facial recognition and things like getting lost and things like that. Sometimes agnosias, addressing apraxias and things like that. But we have other people, the more common one, of course, is memory issues, and that's more of a temporal lobe instead of a parietal lobe function. But Alzheimer's affects both of those.
So this is what explains when we see people that no longer recognize their family. Is it a facial inability to recognize the face again?
It's a great point. That tends to be later. When they don't recognize their family, it tends to be a later thing. In her case, what it was, she would go to her exercise class, for example, and she just could not put names, and she couldn't recognize the various people that were there. And she knew it. I mean, she knew that for a while before she had this diagnosis. And that came back beautifully. And as she said, she was so excited. She would now go out to these classes, and she suddenly realized, oh my gosh, I recognize these people. I know that I know them, is the way she expressed it. And a big difference. So yes, that's a common thing.
Okay, and then the decreasing mental clarity, especially later in the day. These people kind of just wear out as the day goes on, just less reserves.
That's a great point. And that's exactly what happens. So part of this, as I mentioned to you earlier, is energetics. So as your energetics are going down, which can be from, again, blood flow issues, sleep apnea is a very common one. Anything that reduces your oxygenation, your oxygen saturation, huge. And then mitochondrial function. And then even just ketone levels. You need, be able to be metabolically sensitive. As my wife has pointed out so eloquently on many occasions, you've got to have that metabolic flexibility, the ability to slide it's seamlessly back and forth between utilizing ketones and utilizing glucose, which is what your brain should be able to do. And it's interesting, when we see these people, they've typically lost both. So they've lost the ability to utilize glucose as effectively because they have insulin resistance, which is so common. But because they then ramp up their insulin, that prevents you from making ketones. So now you've lost both. So when I see these people, to me, this is an energetic emergency. We want to restore insulin sensitivity, restore glucose utilization.
Okay. Decreased interest in reading or inability to follow or engage in complex conversations, or for instance, follow complicated movie plots. Same kind of idea? there?
I hear this all the time. And it's because, and patient zero said she would start at the top of the page, read to the bottom of the page, and then she'd have to go back to the top of the page again and read it. People will say, I can't read novels anymore. I can't keep the characters straight.
No.
She also, of course, Eleanor couldn't recognize him. So she said she would look and she couldn't tell who was Leonardo DiCaprio and who was Matt Damon. And she mentions to her husband, and he's like, you can't even tell the difference. She said, no, I can't tell the difference. So yes, you give up on reading and watching things that are relatively complex, that are jumping from character to character, because you just can't keep them straight.
Okay, you lose vocabulary.
And that's a really common one. What they'll do is, in fact, by the way, there's a wonderful study looking at the lexicography, basically, the lexical usage for Reagan during his presidency. And we know from when his diagnosis occurred, which was 1994, we know when this started biochemically, because it's typically 15 to 20 years before a diagnosis. So throughout his 2 terms, he had underlying pathophysiology of Alzheimer's. It was just in earlier stages. And so what they showed was that if you look at his choice of words, it went down statistically significantly. He had fewer words. Now, this is when they're looking at his spontaneous speech, his response to questions, not the prepared speeches, of course. They did the same for H.W. Bush, and they showed that it didn't go down statistically significantly. So the argument was you can actually follow this as people make word choices that are more constrained over time. So that's a very common one. And they'll notice as they start improving, oh my gosh, I know these new words are available to me again, things that I would have used 10 years ago, and I'm now able to call up when needed once again.
Okay, at the risk of getting political, is this what we're seeing in President Biden when he has these vacant moments, let's call it? Is he searching for words? Has he lost words?
So, yeah, this is, as you indicated, this is a highly political and highly charged area.
But it's humanitarian at the same time,
Yeah, well, and it affects everybody. So let me make up front some caveats. So number one, you're familiar with the Goldwater rule. This is a rule that was adopted by the APA. It's for psychiatrists because way back in the 1960s, psychiatrists would go on and declare Barry Goldwater crazy, basically, which was inappropriate. So you don't. It subsequently, non-psychiatrists have come out and said yes, it is unethical to render a diagnosis without meeting with and evaluating someone. So we cannot render a diagnosis here. However, we can talk about what has been seen, and we can talk about what testing is needed, because I think that's pretty clear. So I think everybody has noticed the same thing, and it's been pointed out. There is reduced blinking. There is some change in the stability. There is some change in the expression of the face. There is some change in the choice of words, as you said, or at least as in the response, and some what people would refer to as senior moments. I think that's already been commented. That's nothing new about all that. Now, as I've written and as I mentioned recently on another podcast, these are symptoms that you can associate with several conditions. So the good news is there are now very clear tests that can be done for those conditions. So it doesn't have to be a mystery. Now, people have suggested, Parkinson's can look like this. Lewy body disease can look like this. Something called PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, can look like this. Okay, well, there are some good tests for these things now. And in general, the difference between those three is that Parkinson's typically begins with problems with the motor system, of course. It is a motor modulatory disease. And then later, you get the cognitive changes. Lewy body, in contrast, is the opposite. It begins with some cognitive changes, and then you get some motor changes of Parkinsonism later in that disease. And then PSP is one that, again, is more on the motor side, but it affects your eye movements. The good news is you now have a test. You can have someone get a simple, essentially ophthalmological or neuro-ophthalmological test for your saccades and your eye movements, and tell you if you have PSP or not. So that could be done, and maybe it's already been done. I don't know. You can tell that, in 10 minutes. Then there's a new test called SYN1, SYN-1, which can tell you whether someone has Parkinson's or Lewy body. And in fact, both of those are SYN1 positive. But the group that set this up is claiming that they can actually see distinctions in the SYN1 positivity of Parkinson's versus Alzheimer's. It's a skin biopsy. And there, by the way, there's even to me, more interesting test coming, which is a mass spec test for sweat. There is a sweat signature of 400 different peaks that are present in Parkinson's, even 10 years before a diagnosis, which are not present in the non-Parkinson's. And they've done testing. It's beautiful. And this came, by the way, from a nurse who has a very good olfactory capability. And she said, my husband, I could smell his change 10 years before his Parkinson's, and I can smell other people with Parkinson's. They then lined up, it was 25 people. Some had Parkinson's, some did not. Not only did she get every single one correct, but, and she didn't get to see them walk, by the way. This was their T-shirts.
Oh, wow.
He also said, this one that you're claiming is a non-Parkinson's has Parkinson's. And within 9 months, he had a diagnosis. So this is highly accurate and is showing in sebum, basically, again, something that is responding. I think this is going to be so interesting. I think in years, we're going to look back on these periods as kind of a dark ages where we thought this was all about aggregated, misfolded proteins before we realized this is all about your body's response to the things that we are exposed to all the time. So I really hope that in the case of the president, that there will be appropriate testing for these various toxins and things like that, and they will be able to look and be helpful with whatever it is that has been impacting him.
Yeah. So you're saying those tests are available and they're definitive, and
right.
Early detection is not a problem.
And the same thing goes now for Alzheimer's, I would say. And just today, we announced a brain scan, which is 3 tests. Neurocode has done a fabulous job. Neurocode is a company, Dr. Hans Frickman, MD, PhD, developed the most sensitive test for p-tau217. P-tau217 goes up early before you get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So again, just as we went from looking at people's glucose to looking at their hemoglobin A1C to looking at their fasting insulin and even an insulin during a GTT, we can get earlier and earlier looks at people who are headed for diabetes, and we can say, hey, you were going to get diabetes in the future. Absolutely, we can prevent you from getting this. This is the future. Nobody should be getting these diseases, and that includes diabetes, and that includes these various neurodegenerative conditions. That's the way things are headed. And unfortunately, right now, you mentioned the numbers, 7-8 million people with Alzheimer's. It's a huge number. About 15% of the population dies of Alzheimer's. If you go to the UK today, the number 2 cause of death in the UK is Alzheimer's disease, and the number 1 in women is Alzheimer's disease. These are common illnesses.
That's surprising.
And you mentioned earlier the numbers going up, but one thing that's even more important, they're going up more in the young people.
Oh.
So 30-somethings, 40-somethings, 50-somethings, where we used to, when I was training way back in the 1980s, we never saw people of those ages diagnosed with Alzheimer's. They were the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Now, this is often, we see a lot of people in their 40s and 50s.
Yeah, I'm smiling because that tracks also along with data that I'm familiar with on fertility and testosterone levels over the last 50 years.
Absolutely. So as you said, something is changing. we need to be looking at what is this? What are we being exposed to? And of course, there are lots of good candidates, and there probably is going to be all of the above. It's things like the huge change in ultra-processed foods and the huge ability to get fast foods, everywhere, easily, quickly, getting metabolic syndrome. There are 80 million Americans with metabolic syndrome. That increases fairly markedly your likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately. And then, of course, exposure to toxins like never before, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And of course, we as physicians, most of us are not testing for these things, and we're exposing. And of course, then the latest, microplastics and nanoplastics. You may have seen the article that just came out from Spain, where they're looking, they're testing people. They're seeing it in all people, and they're also seeing it in animals. So these things are ubiquitous, and we're going to have to figure out what's their role in these various diseases. I was really surprised by this recent study where they looked at carotid plaque. So if you had plaque that did not include microplastics, okay, you had some plaque, they could remove it. If you had plaque that had microplastics in it, you did worse statistically than if you had plaque without it. So even in both cases, they both had carotid plaque, but the one that included the microplastics actually had a worse prognosis. Oh, wow. That is concerning.
That is. It doesn't surprise me. I've been saying this for years. That's a lot of people dismiss it as, well, they're such small amounts, they're such small doses. But when the word you use, ubiquitous, is a good word. Yeah. The exposure comes from so many different sides, and it's really interesting to see now specifics in neurodegenerative diseases that you're seeing with these things. And I'll bet, do you think the reason that you're seeing some younger people now is because we have a little bit more access to DNA? It's a little more affordable. More people are familiar with it. So are these people that identify that they've got some risk factors like the ApoE4, and therefore come because, okay, I know my risk is a lot higher. What can I do? Do you think that's part of?
It turns out to be a small part. Most of these are symptomatically diagnosed people who went to a neurologist or went to their family doctor, who then typically would send them to a neurologist who said, yes, you have Alzheimer's disease. And so, but here, you've already got an answer here. It's really interesting and sad, unfortunately. So when do we suddenly get a big burst of exposure to this whole system? Well, the World Trade Center was unfortunately an example. Way back in 2001, a whole set of people, first responders and people who were nearby, got this sudden dramatic increase in exposure to toxins. And you look at what's actually been seen when the World Trade Center collapsed. That was a toxic soup like you rarely see. It included everything from mycotoxins to metallotoxins to organic toxins, really scary, and exposure to, of course, to microbes. And the people who were the first responders and who were right there have a 40-fold. Since then, they have documented a 40 times increase in cognitive decline. So that just takes this long term that you and I have just been talking about, and it just squeezes it down to a very short period that they had this exposure. And you see the same things down the road. And many of these people, as you know, were relatively young when they had that exposure. And yet they still developed cognitive decline at a very high rate.
This subset of people that don't have the ApoE4, they say they have two E3s. So in other words, they're down there in the, what was it, 9% risk of Alzheimer's?
Yes, yeah. So they're at 9%.
Is that subset also increasing in their Alzheimer's incidence?
Yes, and by the way, when you get, so you bring up a great point. So let's just set the stage here. When you get Alzheimer's, you go through the 4 stages. You have asymptomatic, then you get SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, that lasts about 10 years. You know something's wrong, but you're still able to test normally. Then you get MCI, mild cognitive impairment, where the tests are abnormal. And then you get dementia, the last stage, the 4th, where you can't do your activities. You're struggling with activities of daily living. So those are the things you go through, as you're developing this. And if you are ApoE4, so you've got 3/4 of the population is ApoE4 negative. As you said, it's 9% risk for that set of people. And I've checked myself. I'm at 3/3, which is the most common, kind of vanilla. So when we get Alzheimer's, we typically get it from toxin-related things, sometimes infections. The difference is ApoE4 are hyper responders immunologically. So no surprise, part of that hyper response is amyloid, just as we talked about earlier. It's part of your innate immune system. So anything that's driving that innate system, that inflammatory part, and not allowing the adaptive part to clear it, increases your risk. And by the way, that's why people who are ApoE4 also have more risk for poor outcomes in COVID-19. But those of us who are ApoE4 negative, when we typically get it, it's either from toxins or it's from vascular changes. So if we're eating a standard American diet and we've got some vascular disease, that can be a problem as well. And we used to think vascular disease and Alzheimer's were unrelated. Now it's very clear they're intimately related. Whereas on the ones, as I mentioned with ApoE4, it's more about the inflammation, and more about classic inflammatory response.
Okay, so your critics say you need more data. More patients on the protocol. How many patients? Do you have an idea of how many patients have been on the protocol now?
Oh yeah, it's been over 7,000 now.
7,000. Okay.
Yeah, and I totally understand. But when people say this, they're really being disingenuous, because they're not saying the other piece of this. Unless there's nothing else to be done and you're looking at compassionate use. Now, let me give you a classical example. About 60 years ago, there was nothing to be done with childhood leukemia. This was a terminal illness. A guy who was a pathologist, Dr. Dana Farber, happened to notice that people had pointed out when people had been given folate, these people would get anemic, they would get folate as part of the treatment, and they would get much worse. So he said, well, maybe the cancer cells are using this folate. Let's use an anti-folate, and let's see if we can get some improvement. He published in the New England Journal 6 cases. This was not a controlled study. Not only was it just 6 cases, the treatment killed 2 of them. Can you imagine this being? Now, how would the critics of today have responded to that?
Oh my gosh!
This was the breakthrough that began successful treatment. So out of the 6, 2 of them were killed. 2 of them did not so great, but 2 of them actually seemed to do a little better and had some remission. So it was clear that they were on the right track, and that was the key. And that started the whole ability. And of course, now there are very good outcomes for childhood leukemia, thanks in part to that beginning. So you've got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. When you've
got drugs that are trying to be sold for billions of dollars and don't do much, of course they're paying consultants. Of course they're going to say, well, there's not enough data yet. So here's the data we had. So we started exactly where Dr. Farber did. We started with, in our case, 10 cases where 9 of them got better. We then published 100 cases where all 100 of them improved. Now, that doesn't give you a denominator. It was hundreds out of we don't know how many. We just looked at the ones documented improvement. Then we did a proof of concept trial in which 84% of the people improved. Then there was an independent trial by Dr. Heather Sanderson. We weren't involved with that. She did this trial. In her case, the same story. The majority of her patients improved. Now we're in the midst of a randomized controlled trial. So there's a well-worn concept, as you well know, which is called compassionate use, and which says when you have something where there's no hope otherwise, then you're allowed to take that, even though it's not down the line, generally accepted by the mainstream and by the FDA and sort of that, because there isn't anything else. Now, why would the critics not say, of course, there is such thing as compassionate use, and clearly that's what you're doing. So again, when you're ignoring the obviousness, do you really want to tell someone, we've only 7,000 people treated, so we're not going to use that. You're going to go ahead and die because there's nothing. I mean, really, that's such a disingenuous approach.
Yeah, and there was a big risk by you improving their nutrition and getting them to do exercise. And what's the downside? There really isn't a downside. So I mean, you're right. The bar's pretty low. Seems like there's pretty good blue water there for you to show some improvement. And you're right. I see that it's disingenuous, or is it somebody just kind of defending? We know how that goes. You've seen it in your line. I've seen it in hormones. You get people that they have this camp that they put themselves into, and in order to change that, they have to admit they were wrong.
Yes.
And that is not something that's easily done in our business, is it?
No, it's not going to happen. And you mentioned doing the basics. So one of the things that has come out of this, instead of the side effects being brain bleeding, brain swelling, and death, the way it is for the antibodies, the side effects of the approach we've taken are better blood pressure. People can often get off their antihypertensives, better glycemic control. So if they're on anti-diabetic drugs, they can often get off those, and improvements in their lipid profiles. So they'll often be able to get off their statins and things like that. So they lose weight, they feel better, they have more energy, they sleep better. I mean, on and on and on. So, I totally understand the critics saying you're making claims that you haven't proven yet. I'd say that's the fairest criticism. Why are we saying these things? Because of compassionate use. We're saying, look, here's hope where there was none before. Mm-hmm. Got to start somewhere, and then you want to keep building on it. The great news is, as we've done the next trials, the next pieces, you don't have a situation where you say, we did a bigger trial and it failed. As we continue to do things, we continue to see the same things. As we talked about earlier, when people go off, they get worse. When they go on, they get better. So we've also shown their MRIs improve. That's hard to fake. And right now we're looking at their biomarkers. So we're looking at what happens to your p-tau 217. Does that improve as you now improve your cognition? We've done cognitive tests, of course, on all these people. Their symptoms, they interact with their families more readily.
But the difference is that you may have removed those amyloid plaque and the tau things, but the difference is not that you went in and ripped them out, but they're not there anymore because they weren't formed.
So what's happening? Yeah, that's actually a very good point. So you have to remember that the amyloid exists in multiple forms, but two important forms to recognize are when it's in a lake. These are then polymeric. Essentially, these are big amyloid plaques. Those aren't particularly toxic. It's a little bit like putting your soldiers in a fort. When they're in the fort, they're not out shooting people. When you then you have an insult, the fort opens up, they come flying out. Now you have these toxic oligomers. They're there to kill bacteria, kill viruses, fungi. Some really nice work from Professor Robert Moyer and Rudy Tanzi from years ago. They showed that these things have multiple antimicrobial effects. So that's what's happening here. You're now responding to these. I've always wondered, why is it that the brain also uses these to downsize? So these things interact with complement, for example, and they reduce your synaptic number. So as you're fighting these things, you're pulling back, just like fighting, a battle. You're killing the insult, but you're also pulling back, unfortunately. So if you don't understand that, then you don't address what's causing it. You just keep pulling back until you can't do your activities of daily living and you die of Alzheimer's. But if you understand that, you identify the reason that you're doing that, you treat that, you now allow the formation of synapses once again. You get them on the synaptoblastic side instead of the synaptoclastic side. Then it makes much more sense and you do much, much better.
The philosophical side of medicine, there's approach that almost really isn't even medicine, it's logic.
Yeah, exactly.
You've had trouble getting funding sometimes. And you know what I see? I can kind of see the point of someone saying, well, when we're trying to assess or compare a shotgun approach, it's hard to know what did what.
Yeah.
But I guess the answer to that is, as you said, just keep doing cases. It starts with a case study, and then it moves to bigger things, and you have hypothesis forming activity, and then you just keep going from there, right?
Well, there's a very important distinction from what you said, and I'm glad you brought that up. So people are looking for a silver bullet, or hits one thing. And if you look at what this disease actually is, that makes no sense, actually, because it's a whole network thing. Dozens and dozens of things are changing. What we're looking at is to get silver buckshot. In other words, you have a multi-pronged approach, but each is targeted. That's why it's silver. So you are targeting all these things. Now, by definition, that is precision medicine. That is the future, to target all the different contributors to this network. And this is where things like AI are really going to focus us to say, aha, these 27 things are the most important ones, or these 12, or these 5, whatever it's going to be. These are the critical things. We have a good idea from the molecular biology what we should be targeting. But we're going to do better and better with some of these, omics approaches, for example, that the Institute for Systems Biology is using, for example, and Phenome, this new company that is looking at these sorts of precision approaches. These are going to be very, very important, and this is the future. Then, targeted pharmaceuticals, they'll have a role. Great, at the right time, the right amounts, the right place. You're going to put all of this together to get much better outcomes.
Well, a lot of drugs have run amok, and with the idea that they're treating something that exists in a vacuum, and have not taken into account just the multiple inputs that are there. And I think that's the beauty of your protocol. So you categorize Alzheimer's into 3 different types, right? So there's the inflammatory, kind of the hot Alzheimer's disease, we call that.
Yep.
Atrophic.
Yep.
Which is the cold. That's more. That's where hormones come in, right?
Low hormones, low nutrients. Low factors.
Right.
Yep.
And then the last is the toxic ones, from toxins and environmental effects that. Am I right? And can you just kind of elaborate on anything we haven't covered in that?
Yeah, great point. So we initially did describe those 3.
Yeah, because the treatment's different for each one, right?
Absolutely. But then we discovered 3 more. And so there's also a vascular, there's also a glycotoxic, and there's also a traumatic. So there are kind of 6 different things that could all contribute to this. And the treatment is different because, again, you're going to take, in all cases, you have reduced supply for your neural network and increased demand. So in all cases, you're going to reduce the demand and you're going to increase the supply. And now you're on the right side of the ledger, right? So in the inflammatory ones, you've really got to focus on getting that inflammation down, helping the adaptive immune system clear the agent. And of course, it helps to identify the agent or agents. It may be P. gingivalis, which is from the oral microbiome. It may be Borrelia.
Which is poor oral health, right? You get this gingivitis.
Poor oral health, which is why we recommend everyone get an evaluation of your oral microbiome and get an evaluation of your gut microbiome. So for the oral microbiome, you want to know things like, do I have P. gingivalis, T. denticola, F. nucleatum, Prevotella intermedia, all these sorts of things. And I should mention, the dental societies are all over this. They've been fantastic. They're very good at looking at the many oral contributors: gingivitis, periodontitis, oral microbiome changes, mercury amalgams, constrained airways, compromised airways. Very, very good. And so for our trials, we send everybody to a trained dental expert who will then help. And some people are going to have going to need help with their root canals and things like that. So that's the inflammatory side. What's causing the inflammation? Address that. We use Resolvins, first suggested by Dr. Charles Sirhan from Harvard. Brilliant work that he's done over the years to identify these resolvins. These things could help take your inflammation down.
Resolvin, let me just clarify that for the listeners. Resolvins are the sort of the other side of the inflammation process, where the body will provide a useful and necessary response involving inflammatory agents. The resolvins say, okay, we're done here. Now go away. Go back. Am I correct?
Exactly. And so now you can do that, and you can help to resolve this ongoing inflammation. Because, of course, for so many of us, as they say, it's called inflammaging. We are aging in large part because of this ongoing mildly inflammatory response. And by the way, there's also this, anti-aging movement now where people are measuring and reducing your biological age. This is why I think when there are questions about presidents, hey, there's so much that can be done now. Hopefully the physicians who are caring for our leaders will do the best for them to help them with their aging-related processes. That's going to be an important piece of the future. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, there's the cold, there's the atrophic, and these people look different. They tend to come in later. The inflammatory ones tend to show up in their early 60s. The atrophic ones tend to show up in their mid 70s. They're not pro-inflammatory. They don't have enough support. They need hormones. They need bioidentical hormones, of course. They need they need trophic factors, and they need nutrients to support this system. They don't have enough support for the system, and they often look different. They often will look a little wizened. They don't have that support. It's interesting. When I first defined these subtypes, I thought, wow, we really just discovered something new. And then it turned out the Ayurvedic physicians of thousands of years ago had said the same thing. So they were seeing these sorts of differences thousands of years ago. We just, rediscovered what they had published, many, many years ago. And so when you treat those people, you optimize those levels. Very different approach. And then the third group, as you mentioned, the toxins.
Let me ask you something about the atrophic group before you move on.
Sure.
So do you think you said they come in older at a later stage?
This is on average.
In general,
now, some of them come in early, but on average, this is typically a 75-year-old person instead of a 62-year-old person.
So you think part of that is they have a reduced appetite? They're not getting enough macros, enough proteins, fat, and so that then they're not getting also vitamins and minerals that come with that food because they're eating less of it?
Not just a reduced appetite, but reduced absorption. And that's one of the most important things. You need to absorb these things, as you know. You need to have appropriate acidity, and that often is decreased as we age. You need to have appropriate digestive enzymes. So a lot of these people will do much better when they have digestive enzymes and they have some betaine HCl to get their pH down when they eat appropriately. They start to absorb, they start to get a more normal weight, they start to look better, they start to think better, they start to do better.
Amazing. Okay, the toxic one.
Yeah, the toxic one is the toughest because you've been exposed to these things for years. So typically what's happening, you are sequestering, of course, your body when it's exposed to these, and it's inorganics like air pollution and mercury. It's organics like toluene and benzene and glyphosate and hundreds more. And then it's also the biotoxins, things like trichothecenes, gliotoxin, ochratoxin A, things like that. Things coming from Stachybotrys and Penicillium and Aspergillus and Chetomium and Wallemia, those sorts of things. So all of these different things are critical. And unfortunately, your body is constantly, as it's being exposed, it's metabolizing them, it's excreting them through sweat, through urine, through your excrement, all these sorts of things, through your breath, all of these things. But it's also sequestering them in your bones and in your organs. And one of the things that we didn't understand at first was why so many times we would see women in the 48 to 53-year-old category coming in with new presentation of Alzheimer's. And they often will have some depression ahead of this. And we realize that what's happening is they're going through the osteoclastic burst. When you are going through perimenopause and then menopause, you are now re-releasing these as you are now taking up this bone material, and you're now heading for the future of osteoporosis. You're re-releasing these toxins back into your bloodstream, so they are affecting your cognition. So we need to help detox you. So there's a whole protocol that it used to get best outcomes. And it's going to take some time. As you know, people detox for years often. This is why I do think these kind of the rebirth of medical spas is important. People are detoxing early, never getting to the point of having all these symptoms. And so for people who are detoxing, it's going to include improving your sweat, so more exercise and more saunas. Striking data on men using saunas from Finland, showing that those who use saunas more had much lower rates of cognitive decline. Really striking data. It's going to be, it's going to be eating organic fruits, especially for the so-called dirty dozen. It's going to be improving your water intake and your urine expulsion of these. It's going to be high fiber diets, and then it's going to be using things like binders that where Dr. Shoemaker and Dr. Neil Nathan have been so excellent at helping us to show, hey, here's how you detox people best. And I should mention Dr. Nathan just came out with an excellent book that is called The Sensitive Patient's Healing Guide, and talks about people who get these toxins over the years and what it takes to get rid of these things.
What's his name again?
These without knowing. What's that?
What is his name again?
Dr. Neil Nathan.
Nathan, okay, great.
Yeah, a real expert in this area. So you need to do the detox. And interestingly, the people who have this type 3, this toxicity type, do need, they actually, even more than the others, I mean, all of them do better, by the way, with BHRT. But particularly the type 2 and type 3, the atrophic ones, they need their hormones. And the type 3s do much better when they have optimal hormones in their overall detox. And they do better when they have crucifers and things like that are helping detox over time, getting their glutathione levels up, all those things.
And when you say the hormones, specifically, which ones are you talking about? Talking about testosterone?
And I'm talking about, for women, estradiol, progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, and even small amounts of testosterone, and often thyroid. And then for men, I'm talking about testosterone. These things have all been shown to be important neurosteroids in brain function.
Do you have any quantitative numbers or data on the difference, say, estradiol can make for women in the reduction of Alzheimer's? I mean, I've heard numbers that are pretty high.
Yeah, so that's been published. The Stanford study. I know Dr. Anne Hathaway, that I do town halls with, is always a real expert in this area, and she always quotes that study. So there are numerous studies, such as that one, that show improvement. Now, this, as you know, this is a highly contentious area. People will say, you shouldn't be talking about hormones. So we're only interested in one thing: best outcomes for people with cognitive decline. We recognize you've got to take these things into account. Look, if someone is being treated for a hormone-sensitive breast cancer, of course, that's not the issue then. We'll do the best we can without those. But for people in general who are undergoing cognitive decline or are at risk for cognitive decline, BHRT is an important part of the optimization to decrease your risk and to improve your cognition.
And those are the majority anyway. So, when trying to speak to the masses here, hormones in general are a good thing, a significant thing for reduction in risk of cognitive decline. Yep. That's been preaching that for quite a while. So, all right, let's get to the part most people are waiting for here, probably the actual protocols. I'm guessing. Well, it's been helpful, I'm sure, to have the DNA information, but it seems like everything you've talked about kind of wasn't even talking about that. You're just talking about everything besides ApoE status and a few other genes that can affect Alzheimer's risk. So let's kind of, without getting into all the details, I mean, you've been very generous with your protocols in the books that you've written, so it's there for people to look at in detail. But kind of give us the broad strokes on the protocols.
Yeah. Straightforward. So there are three pieces to say. The first piece is testing. You want to know, all we are really doing is treating the things that are causing the problem. I mean, that seems like it should be pretty straightforward and pretty obvious. We're identifying the things that are causing the problem. We're treating those things.
Can this testing be expensive, or is it covered a lot by insurance?
Yeah, so the testing, here's the way I usually think of it. The average American before dying of Alzheimer's disease will spend $350,000, unfortunately, much of it on nursing homes. So we're talking about something that is overall, over years, going to be about 1/10 of that. So you're going to save yourself a huge amount by getting in early. The initial testing is typically going to run somewhere in the $800 to $1,000 to find out, because you need to know your homocysteine, and you need to know your HSCRP, and you need to know your HOMA-IR, and you need to know what various toxins you've been exposed to.
That's going to help you classify them into one of those.
And it's going to help tell you what you have to treat.
Yeah, okay.
And then when you go to the treatment, we think in terms of 7 basics and then going to the specifics. So that's why I say there's 3 parts. There's the testing part, then there's the basics, those are 7 things, and then there's the specifics. The basics are diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and some targeted supplements. So straightforward, it's a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. You need to have that, be able to get into ketosis, but also be able to be insulin sensitive. You need to have appropriate exercise. I particularly like EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy, because it gives you both the blood flow and the oxygenation. In the testing, we make sure that you don't have sleep apnea, a very common contributor to cognitive decline. So we think now in terms of contributors, not just one cause, contributors to this network insufficiency. And so you want to look at those 7, the diet, exercise, sleep. You want to have at least 7 hours of sleep, at least 1 hour of deep sleep, at least 1.5 hours of REM sleep. So, I check myself every night now. I'm in my 70s now. So I am, I'm not going to sleep as easily as when I was in my 40s, for example. But I check to make sure, did I get 7 hours of sleep? Did I get at least an hour of deep sleep? Did I get at least, an hour and a half of REM sleep? And very helpful to know. And of course, sleep hygiene, all sorts of good things around that.
And there's effective wearables that can help you see that, right?
To me, wearables are the kryptonite of the Superman of chronic illness of 21st century. This horrible, the bad Superman, which is killing. The vast majority of us are dying of complex chronic illnesses. The kryptonite for those is wearables, because you see ahead of time, this is, I'm having changes in my SpO2. I'm having changes in my heart rate variability. I'm having changes in my temperature. All these things are so helpful, and you can look at these things. And you mentioned DNA. There's so much that all of us as consumers can do today to see where we stand and get way ahead of these diseases. The problem with these diseases has been that they don't give you the symptoms until late in the course. Whereas, pneumococcal pneumonia, which was a 20th century disease, gives you early symptoms. Boom, you throw in the the antibiotics, and you're fine. If we wait for symptoms now, then we're waiting until late in the stage. There was a very nice paper recently out of China, published in the New England Journal just a couple months ago, where they documented very nicely as people developed Alzheimer's and showed that you can pick up changes 18 years ahead of time. And then you can follow in a very orderly sequence to the point where they actually got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So again, these wearables are really going to be helpful for all of us.
What about families that come to you and their loved one is well into Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
Do you still get the reversal effects, or does it get not as effective the later they are in the disease?
Yeah. So just quickly to finish up the 7, so it's diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training. Then detox we talked about, and some targeted supplements. We want to optimize the things that are there, and there are all sorts of excellent supplements these days. And then for the specifics, it's mostly pathogens and toxins. You want to look to see if a person has pathogens or toxins, and you want to treat those. Now, you mentioned people who are coming in late. Yes, we see people even with MoCA scores of 0 improve. And actually, I got a nasty letter a few years ago from a guy who said, "Hey, you're telling people that not to bother coming in if it's really, really late." He said, "My wife has a MoCA score of 0. She's in a nursing home. We put her on the protocol anyway. Hey, she's interacting with us better. She's doing better." So yes, you can get some improvement even late, but it's harder to get it all the way back. We've seen people if you go from 0 to 30 on your MoCA score, that 30 is perfect.
Okay.
We've seen people go from 18, which is in the dementia range, all the way to a perfect 30. We've seen people go from 0 to 9. We've never seen anybody go from 0 to 30. That's my hope, that we'll be able to do that at some point while I'm still here. But you do see people, they'll get back their ability to speak and to dress themselves and interact with the family. The most common thing I hear from family members when people are doing the right things, they say, wow, they're so much more engaged with the family again. One of the very first people that I ever saw had multiple things. Her homocysteine was 24, very high. She had some obvious things to treat. She came back 3 months later with her family. Before, she had been kind of staring off into space. She had what's called the head turning sign, when every time you ask her a question, she turns to her spouse for an answer. Came back and she actually slapped me on the knee and she said, "Hey doc, I'm doing great." Like, what? It was a different person. They're more engaged. They're hitting on all cylinders. Now, she wasn't completely back to normal, but she was so much better. And then unfortunately she decided, well, she didn't really want to do this. And so she started going downhill again. So you've got to optimize things. And I always tell people, just keep tweaking, because you'll see people get better and better and better over time.
Yep. Isn't that the way it is with everything healthy? I mean,
Yes.
we try and do our best to teach these things, and you got to be a realist. People will adopt them and incorporate them into their lives as they can, and that's okay. That's fine. Do what you can and get the benefit. It tends to be contagious, which is a good thing. Feeds on itself, but yeah, that's great. Can you go into a little bit about omega-3s and their effect on cognitive decline? I'm a big advocate of omega-3s. I think that's...
Absolutely. And that's one of many wonderful things. So of course, most of us have a very high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, on average 15 or 20. We should be down between 1-to-1 and 4-to-1. And so we are low typically in our omega-3s. We tend to be high in our omega-6s. Omega-3s, of course, are unsaturated fats, and they are anti-inflammatory. And by the way, they are precursors for resolvins. So another great outcome of these things. They are synaptoblastic. They support synaptic formation. So when Dr. Wertman from MIT was doing his studies over the years, he showed that combining DHA, one of the long-chain omega-3s, docosahexaenoic acid, with citicoline, that actually resulted in greater synaptic densities. So they have multiple positive outcomes and positive incentives and inductions for improving your cognition, for improving your synaptic density, and for reducing cognitive decline.
Okay, good. Thank you. Tell us about gray matters. What is that clinic just in Florida? You have the 3 Florida offices?
Yeah, so Craig Weston, Deb Geisler, Howard Bird, and myself, all very interested in how do we spread this? How do we get it so people are using best practices? And Apollo Health, which was set up to do the software side of things, and have all been interested in how do we make this more available? How do we make this more applicable? And Deb, Howard, and Craig all have a tremendous background in setting up networks. And I'm very interested, of course, in mechanistics. How do we make the underlying mechanisms of brain degeneration reduce? And how do we get a better outcome? And Dr. Will Niels, who's an excellent physician, is there. They have 3 sites right now. So they have the Jacksonville in Florida, as well as Sarasota, as well as Ponte Vedra, and looking to expand this to around the country. Just a huge success there. The Medicare has designated specific centers, only 97 of them around the country, one of them being gray matters. So my hope is that this will now allow other sites to be part of gray matters, that can do this, can work with Medicare, can get people better. Because, look, we all recognize this is a huge need. This is a $1 trillion global problem. So if we can get people to come in early, change the narrative, get people to understand, please come in early, help the people who are on Medicare, who now need some support and are going to places where they're going to get an ineffective drug. Dr. Niels, the gray matter team can do much better. The Apollo community has a community of about 3,000 people around the world, with town halls and all sorts of things like that. So the armamentarium is growing, and the ability for people to utilize this to prevent and reverse cognitive decline is getting better and better and better.
Good. So the Medicare program, they're using your protocol, or
Yes. So Gray Matters is using this, and again, as I said, Deb, for example, Deb Geisler in particular, has tremendous experience. She's not a physician, but she is able to grow these networks and make them highly effective. So she has set up a network that is about primary care and cognition together. That's really the fundamental of Gray Matters.
Oh, yeah.
So I look for this to be something that is utilized throughout the country, and which is addressing people's needs in a primary care area and including their cognition. It's interesting. It's been said for years, shouldn't primary care physicians be thinking more about cognition? Mm-hmm. They typically haven't even been looking at it. And so the push has been to get them to do some basic things, but there hasn't been a mechanism to do this. They don't get reimbursed for this. Now that's coming. And so
that's great.
This is where I think Gray Matters is going to change the paradigm.
That's great. That's what you need. We got to get education out there. Hopefully this will help. And the fact that Medicare is participating, that's huge too. That's pretty recent. I know Craig just was telling me about that.
This was just approved recently, and literally the program just started a few weeks ago.
Oh, I hope you have great success with that. So are there any opportunities for telemedicine with this, or do people actually have to come into those offices?
Glad you mentioned that. There is a tremendous opportunity for telemedicine, and here's why. If you're trying to do something where you have to be touching the patient, then it's much harder. But here's a situation, you're talking about cognition. So you can interact with the patient. You can do some testing of the patient. You then can get blood results. You can get imaging results. You can get panels. You can get this new, what we call brain scan, which looks at your p-tau 217, things like that, GFAP, NFL. You can get a tremendous understanding. And so you may do one visit and then be able to do the vast majority by telemedicine. And so this is an area which lends itself to telemedicine, which of course makes it much easier for people around the world to get help, people in need.
So these tests and everything, then that should be covered too by Medicare.
So some of them are, yes. Again, we're in a transition period. Some of them are, some of them aren't.
Well, that's really moving in the right direction.
Forward to the day. Yeah, I look forward to the day when they say, look, everybody needs this panel. Of course, we're going to cover this panel.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm probably dealing with my followers with caregivers or of those that may be suffering from this sort of thing. So this is huge for them to know that, because it has the reputation of being terribly expensive. Any treatment for memory care or cognitive issues, and so I this is great. This is really great.
And this is where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no question. As I said earlier, if you're going to wait for going to a nursing home, you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over a few years that you're alive. It's horrible, and you're going to be in a sad state. I often ask people, this new anti-aging wave, who wants to live to 140, and a bunch of hands shoot up, and then I say, and spend half of that time in a nursing home with dementia. And of course, all the hands come back. Nobody wants to spend half their life in a nursing home with dementia.
No.
Let's make it so that we have good brain aging. And I should mention, brain aging is a close relative. I call them Siamese cousins. I understand that that's considered an inappropriate term these days, so apologies for that. That's what I grew up learning.
It's okay. I think Siam doesn't exist anymore. I think you're
right. I get it. Okay, so let's say that they're closely related. Brain aging and Alzheimer's disease are close relatives, and the major difference is the inflammatory component that we see as amyloid and tau, which in brain aging, you may or may not see that. Many, many people die at 100 years old and have amyloid and tau, and were never diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So again, these are very similar things, related processes. When you've got that hyper response, which, as I mentioned earlier, more common with ApoE4, you're going to go faster. You're going to have earlier brain aging. You're going to have what's called Alzheimer's disease, and you're going to be pulling back on those synaptic connections. So for all of us, we can do much, much better, much, much less expensively, and have a much longer brain span, health span, and lifespan.
Even those with ApoE4.
Absolutely. And there are people, we mentioned one in that we have a book coming out next year about brain aging.
Yeah.
And one of the examples is a guy, Henry, and he's like, he wants to make sure that things stay good. He's an ApoE44, just wants to make sure things are in good shape. He turns out to be 100 years old. He's already made it to 100, and he's sharp. This does happen. So ApoE4 is a risk factor. It's not your fate. You get on the right things, you do the right things, you can do well.
That's amazing. That ApoE44 combination is a 50% increased risk, is it not?
It's more than that. In fact, there was a paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago saying that it should be called essentially a genetic certainty. That it should quit be calling a risk factor and it should be called a gene associated with Alzheimer's. I disagree with that because the people that they looked at were not on an appropriate protocol. So sure, if you're taking a standard American diet, then yeah, and you're exposed to all these toxins and things, your risk is going to be virtually 100% if you're a 4-4. But that doesn't mean it has to be that way. Bring it down.
Well, that's the fact that it re-injects hope into this. I think that's one of the biggest points that I've taken away from our discussion today is you've injected hope where there was none, where it was hopeless. And a lot of people still have that mindset about it, and I understand why. It's an education issue. If people understand you're out there doing this, you're actually seeing results. You're seeing reversals. The name of your protocols, Restat.
Recode.
Recode.
Oh, yeah.
And
Reversal of cognitive decline.
right, and pre-code. Prevention of cognitive decline. Yeah. So if people see those abbreviations, they'll know what those are.
And instead of arguing about where we are, look, we're not at the end stage yet. Let's keep getting better and better and better. I wish that people would waste less time on saying, I don't believe it. Instead, say, you know what? I think it could be even better. Look, Edison, who developed the light bulb, he was not the first to do this. There was another guy who had a light bulb before Edison. Edison went and studied it, looked at it, and said, I can do better. Now, do we kind of remember Edison. So let's make the protocol better instead of arguing that it doesn't work.
Oh, no question about it. You've trained other doctors on these protocols. So people can contact Gray Matters, and people want to know where they can go for this. But you've trained other doctors on these protocols. About how many do you think you've are actively practicing and using it?
So over 2,000 have trained, and it's over 2,000 doctors. But then in addition to the doctors, it's also naturopathic doctors, and of course they're doctors as well. Naturopathic doctors, MDs, neuropsychologists, nurse practitioners, health coaches, on and on. These people all play critical roles, nutritionists, I would add another one, in helping people to get better. So if you're looking for a clinic, you're looking for treatment, you want to go to Gray Matters. If you're looking for learning Recode, so there's Recode 2.0 training, which is available through Apollo Health. You can look up Recode 2.0 training. You can go to My Cognoscopy to get testing. You can go to getabrainscan.com, which is for these new biomarker tests, which I'm getting myself. Everybody should know their status. Just like you want to know your blood pressure, just like you want to know your ApoB, you also should want to know your p-tau217, GFAP, and NFL. And we also have an excellent report that'll explain each of these to you. And if you need follow-up, there's follow-up as well.
So this is for patients, or is this for practitioners, those resources that you just gave?
So this is the first direct to consumer. So anybody can figure out their p-tau217 status. And I should say it's the most sensitive one. Dr. Frickman did a fabulous job at developing something that's very sensitive. So you now have a place to go with Gray Matters, and my hope again is that this is going to soon be available everywhere. As you mentioned, telemedicine is possible. You have a place to go for training at Recode 2.0 training through Apollo Health. So really, the entire infrastructure that should help us to reduce the global burden of dementia is being put in place. It is largely in place now.
Great. So let's just go through your books here. You've got, as I said, you've been quite generous in getting this stuff out there for people to see and kind of do it yourself. So let's go through them for our listeners here. The big one, your New York Times bestseller, that was End of Alzheimer's.
End of Alzheimer's, right. And then what happened with that one was people said, well, we'd like some more specifics. Yeah, and people still follow that. I really appreciate it. I'm very interested in doing an update. So we're putting a lot of the updates to that one in this new one on brain aging because there is this close relationship. So many people said we want more, and so more specifics. And so I actually worked with Julie G. and my wife, Dr. Aida Lasheen Bredesen, to put the second book together. There's a handbook there that they wrote, which is a beautiful way for people to get specifics. This is called the End of Alzheimer's Program. So this is now the program that goes with the End of Alzheimer's. So I'm so appreciative for the great job they did with that. And then we have, additionally with that one, had some updates because we're learning new things as we see people all the time. And then the third one was called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. And that's just because the thing that's been most exciting to me is to see how the biological, conceptual approaches. Here's what these degenerative diseases represent. That has been translated and giving good outcomes. We want to be better and better, of course, but it's giving us good outcomes for the first time. And so to hear these stories from these people has just been so wonderful.
Oh, very inspiring.
Yeah, and I encourage people, read those 7 stories. And it tells people, it gives them the message, everybody can do this. Please don't give up. Please work with an optimal practitioner. Please do the right things and help to get best outcomes. So that's the third book.
Great. And then, so the one coming up that will be released in March of next year?
That'll be next year. So that'll be next year. We don't have a month yet. I don't yet know, but that'll be out next year, 2025.
Okay.
And that will be all about brain aging.
Brain aging. And how's that different than these other things? What do you talk about differently there?
So the difference there is that we're talking not just about a disease process. We're talking about how do people get sharpness and keep it to 100. So the idea is, let's get everybody to 100 and still be very sharp. What are the things you have to measure? What are the things you have to do? What are the warning signs that tell you, okay, you got to get a little more serious about this? What should you be doing when you're 20, 30, 40, 50, and each decade thereafter?
Oh, great.
How often should you be getting these tests? What are the things, when should you be thinking about changing your nutritional status? How worried should you be about toxin exposure? When should you begin to measure those things? It's really about how to age best, how to get the best brain span possible. We've heard a lot about aging and death and cardiovascular disease and all that. This is specifically about your brain span.
Okay. So they can reach you at graymatters.com, and then Apollo Health, if they just Google it, I'm guessing.
ApolloHealth.com.
ApolloHealth.com, okay.
Or drbredesen.com is another way to reach me.
Okay.
You can, there's on Facebook, Instagram, X, all of those.
Okay. And those are, it's Dr. Bredesen, that's your
Those
Instagram.
are Dr. Dale Bredesen.
Dr. Dale Bredesen.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. People are going to want to know where they can go and how they can respond to this.
Yeah.
So when Dale Bredesen is long gone and spoken of in reverent tones, what is it you want to be remembered by?
For just trying to get better outcomes, you trying to use the basic science to get better outcomes. I have long ago given up on any idea of recognition from my colleagues. Many of my colleagues literally will not speak to me. But it's interesting. What happened was I spent virtually all my career in academics, writing grants, I've on the National Aging Council, all that sort of stuff. These are all peer review, and peer review has a strong part, which is experts are telling you whether something works or not. But peer review has a huge weakness as well. It becomes political. Mm-hmm. So I got to the point I remember it pretty well. I was given a talk at Emory in Georgia, and I was starting to say, wait a minute, we're seeing some things that go against the standard of claims and the standard of care. And I was talking to one of the scientists there, and I said, at this point in my career, I'm not worried about people saying we're not going to fund your grant or we're not going to give you tenure. I had tenure from many years before. What I do want to do is say, here's the truth of what's coming out of this. You might not like it. It might not be what you've studied. Maybe I'm not scratching your back and you're not scratching mine. We're not having a political, namaste moment here. Kumbaya. You may be going to be angry at me. I'm saying you're wrong, but here's what's right. And so, my hope is if there's anything said, it will be that we reported what's actually happening. And so far, all of the studies have backed up our claims that this is not a simple illness. This is not something where a monotherapy is the optimal way to go. Yeah, you might be able to make some money selling an anti-amyloid antibody, but it's not the optimal way to go. That what we're doing is the optimal way to go. Precision medicine. That's the way for the future.
Isn't it great when you reach a point in your career when you can stand there and just speak your truth and you just don't care? I mean, I know what I serve and I serve truth.
And
take it or leave it.
So people are going to get angry, but if you're going to deliver, it's not going to be agreed to, but you're not going to be popular. But can you really live with yourself if you don't? can you really say, I mean, I've been just shocked. People who've been paid to say, oh, these drugs are really a breakthrough, really, really wonderful. Really? I mean, are you really going to go to your grave making a claim that you know not to be true? That's sad.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, my profound thanks to you for your time this afternoon. It's not every day that I get to spend an hour with somebody who, with no overstatement at all, is a pioneer, and I see you that way.
Thanks, Lane. Appreciate it.
Alzheimer's disease has chewed up and spit out a lot of great minds since Aloysius gave us that little bit of information back in, what was it, 1906?
1906. But each of these, there used to be, there was that saying about, we see so far because we stand on the shoulders of giants. That was from the father of physiology, Claude Bernard. But each person has said things like, okay, wait, something's missing here. There's something more. And so it really has been a staircase. Now we're saying, okay, but you've got to make a right turn at the top of the stairs there. But we're seeing that all these things that were learned over the years are giving us the ability to help people that were not salvageable before.
Yep, no question about it. Well, what you've done is pretty special. Let me just say on behalf of a lot of people out there that we're grateful for your courage and seeing this through. Let's get the word out. There's new hope for the hopeless.
Thanks, Lane.
Thank you, Dr. Bredesen.